Fireside Tailes with Wolfgang, Episode 18. Originally broadcast on GWC Productions YouTube channel, CAPS Media Television Channel 6, KPPQ-LP Ventura at 104.1 FM, and on the KPPQ Podcast Network. Greetings and salutations. I'm Hunter Ackerman, here to read some classic literature for you and my beastly feline companion Wolfgang. So, Wolfus, what do you want to hear? So, now for something completely different. By an author named Alphonse Daudet. And Daudet was born in 1840, and he passed away in 1897. So imagine this, just imagine this to be taking place in 1800s Paris. I'll put it that way. This is The Siege of Berlin by Alphonse Daudet. We were walking up the avenue des Champs-Élysées. Dr. V, trying to read the story of the siege of Paris in the shell-scarred walls and the sidewalks plowed up by grape shot. Just before we reached the circle, the doctor stopped and, pointing out to me one of the big corner houses so pompously grouped around the Arc de Triomphe, he told me this story. Do you see those 4 closed windows right there above the balcony? During the first day of August, which happens to be Christina Bielen's birthday, that terrible August of last year, so full of storms and disaster, I was called there to attend a very severe case of apoplexy. This is an incapacity due to a stroke, to be real specific. The patient was Colonel Jouve, once a cuirassier of the First Empire and now an old gentleman mad about glory and patriotism. At the outbreak of the war, he had gone to live in the Champs-Élysées in an apartment with a balcony. Can you guess why? That he might be present at the triumphant return of our troops. Poor old boy. The news of Wissembourg reached him just as he was leaving the table when he read the name of Napoleon at the foot of that bulletin of defeat. He had a stroke, and he fell. I found the old cuirassier out on the carpet with his face bleeding and motionless as if struck by a heavy blow. If he had been standing, he would have seemed a tall man, but stretched out as he was, he seemed immense. He had a fine face, magnificent teeth, a thick head of curly white hair, and though 80 years old, did not look more than 60. Near him his granddaughter knelt, weeping, and there was a strong family resemblance between the two of them. Seeing them side by side, he thought of 2 beautiful Greek medals struck from the same matrix, but one old and worn, and the other bright and clear-cut with all the brilliancy and smoothness of a first impression. I found the child's grief very touching. Daughter and granddaughter of a soldier, the sight of this splendid old man stretched out before her had suggested to her another scene no less terrible. I did all I could to reassure her, but in my own mind, I was not any terribly hopeful. There was no question that the stroke had been apoplectic, and that is the sort of thing from which at 80, one does not recover. As it turned out, the sick man remained in a state of coma for 3 days. Meanwhile, the news of the Battle of Reichshoffen reached Paris. You'll remember in what form that news reached us first. Until evening, we had all believed that we had won a great victory with 20,000 Prussians killed and the crown prince captured, though through some miracle, some magnetic current, an echo of this national rejoicing must have reached the sufferer, deaf and speechless and unable to move though he was. That evening I went to his bedside, and I found a different man. His eye was clear, his tongue was no longer thick, and he had strength enough to smile at me and to stammer, "Victory." Yes, Colonel. A great victory. And the more details I gave him of MacMahone's brilliant success, the more his face relaxed and brightened. As I left, I found the little girl waiting for me outside the door. She was pale, and she was crying. "But he's going to get well," I said, taking her hands in mine. The poor child, she hardly had the courage to answer me. The true story of the Battle of Reichshoffen had just appeared on the bulletin boards. MacMahon was retreating and the army was cut to pieces, surprised and shocked. Our eyes met, she thinking of her father and I of my patient. Surely he would succumb to this new blow, and yet, what could we do? Leave him the joy, the illusion that had brought him back to life? That meant keeping him alive with lies. "Very well, I will tell him," said the child, and quickly wiping away her tears, she went back to her grandfather's room with a smile on her face. It was not an easy task which she had set herself. For the first few days, she had no great difficulty. The old gentleman's head was very weak, and he was as easily deceived as a child, but as his strength came back, his mind became clearer. He wanted to be kept in touch with troop movements, and to have the War Department bulletin read to him. It was pathetic to see the little girl, night and day, bent over her map of Germany, sticking in pins with little flags on them and trying hard to invent the last detail to a successful campaign. Bazaine advancing on Berlin, Frossard penetrating Bavaria, MacMahon reaching the Baltic. To work all this out, she needed help. And I helped her as much as I could. But the one who helped her the most was her grandfather himself. He had conquered Germany so many times during the First Empire, he knew every move. "This will be the enemy's next move, yeah?" he would say, and ours will be this. His anticipations were always justified by the event, which made him not only a little proud. Unhappily, no matter how fast we took cities and won battles, we never went fast enough for him. The old fellow was insatiable. Each day as I came in, I learned of some new success. "Doctor, we have taken Mayence," said the little girl, coming to meet me with a smile that went to your heart, and through the door I heard his glad salutation. "We are getting on. In another week we shall be in Berlin." At that time, the Prussians were only a week's march from Paris. At first, we wondered whether or not we had better carry our patient into the country. Then, we reflected that as soon as he was taken out of the house, he would learn the true state of affairs, and I decided that he was still too feeble, too stunned by his stroke to let him find out the truth. So, we decided to stay where we were. The first day of the Prussian occupation, I climbed the stairs to his apartment, I remember, with a heavy heart at the thought of all the closed doors of Paris and the fighting going on under her walls in the suburbs, which were now on the frontier. I found the old gentleman sitting up in bed, jubilant and proud. "Well," he said, "the siege has begun." I looked at him in amazement. "So, you know now, Colonel?" His grandchild turns to me hurriedly. "Why, yes, Doctor. That is the great news today. The siege of Berlin has begun." And while she spoke, she went on with her sewing as calmly as you please. How could he suspect what was happening? He couldn't hear the guns at the fortifications. He couldn't see the city in its fear and sorrow. From his bed, he could see one side of the Arc de Triomphe, and his room was filled with odds and ends of the period of the First Empire, all admirably fitted to sustain his illusions. Portraits of Napoleon's marshals, battle prints, a picture of the little king of Rome in his baby dress, big stiff consoles decorated with trophies, covered with imperial relics, medallions, bronzes, a piece of the Rock of St. Helena under a glass case, miniatures, all representing the same blue-eyed lady, now with hair curled, now in a ball dress, now in a yellow gown with mutton sleeves. And all this, consuls, king of Rome, marshals, yellow gowned, short-waisted ladies with that prim stiffness that was considered graceful in 1806, this atmosphere of victory and conquest. It was this, more than anything we could say to him, that made him accept so naively the siege of Berlin. After that day, our military operations grew simpler and simpler. Nothing but a little patience was needed in order to take Berlin. Every little while, when the old gentleman grew listless, we read him a letter from his son. An imaginary letter, of course, as Paris was by now cut off, and as since Sedan, the aide-de-camp of MacMahon had been sent to a German fortress. You can easily imagine the despair of the poor child who heard nothing from her father, knowing that he was a prisoner, deprived of even comfort and perhaps sick, while she had to write letters in his name that were full of joy and brief indeed, such as a soldier would write from the field, a soldier advancing day by day through the enemy's country. Sometimes it was too much for her, and weeks went by without a letter. The old man began to worry and to be unable to sleep. Then, presto! A letter from Germany would arrive, and she would read it gaily at her grandfather's bedside, holding back her tears. The old colonel would listen gravely, smile knowingly, approve, criticize, and explain to us any passage which seemed confused. But it was in the replies that he made to his son that he was magnificent. "Never forget that you are French," he wrote. "Be generous to the poor Germans. Don't let them suffer more than is inevitable from the invasion of their country." And then came suggestions without end, charming, moralizing on property rights and the courtesy due to women, a veritable honor, a veritable code of honor for conquerors. All this was interwoven with reflections on politics and discussions of the peace terms. On this last point, he was not unduly exacting. Indemnity and nothing more. What good would their provinces be to us? France could never be made out of a Germany. He dictated that in a firm voice, and one could not hear him without emotion. There was so much sincerity, so beautiful a patriotism in what he said. Meanwhile, the siege was progressing. but not the siege of Berlin, unfortunately. We had reached the period of severe cold, the bombardment, the epidemics, the famine. But thanks to our efforts, to the infinite tenderness which enfolded him, the serenity of the old man was never troubled. To the end, I was able to get white bread and fresh meat for him alone, of course. You can't imagine anything more touching than these luncheons, so innocent in their egotism. The old gentleman sitting up in bed, fresh and smiling, his napkin tucked under his chin, his pale little granddaughter at hand to guide his hand, make him drink, and help him as he ate all these forbidden good things. Then, animated by his meal and the comfort of his warm room, while the winter's wind whistled outside and the snowflakes whirled around the windows, the ex-cuirassier told us for the 100th time the story of the retreat from Russia when frozen biscuit and horseflesh was all that there was to eat. Do you realize what that means, little one? We had to eat horse. Did she realize what that meant? For 2 months, she had eaten no other meat other than horse. As time went on, and the old gentleman recovered little by little, our task increased in difficulty. The numbness of the senses, which had made it so easy to deceive him, was disappearing day by day. 2 or 3 times already the terrible cannonading at the Porte de Maillot had made him jump, his ear as keen as a hunting dog's, and we had been obliged to invent a last victory for Bazin at the gates of Berlin, and salvos fired at the Invalides in honor of the event. Another day, when his bed had been brought over to the window, it was, I think, the Thursday on which the Battle of Buzenval was fought, he distinctly saw the troops of the National Guard formed on the Avenue de la Grande Armée. "What are those troops?" asked the old gentleman, and we heard him mutter, "They are not well set up." It went no farther, but we understood that thereafter we must take every precaution. Unfortunately, we were not sufficiently careful. One evening, as I reached the house, the little girl came to meet me, considerably troubled. "It is tomorrow that they enter the city," she said. Was the door of her grandfather's bedroom open? In thinking it all over afterward, I remember that this evening his face wore a very striking expression. Probably he had overheard us, but while we were talking of the entry of the Prussians, the old gentleman was thinking of the triumphant return of the French troops, for which he had been so long waiting. MacMahon marching down the avenue in the midst of flowers, his son at the marshal's side, and he himself on his balcony, wearing his full-dress uniform as he did at Lutzen, saluting the riddled flags and the powder-blackened eagles. Poor old Juve. No doubt he thought that we did not want him to participate in this review of our troops, in the fear that his emotion would be too much for him, so he carefully avoided speaking of it. But the next day, at the very minute when the Prussian battalions started on their march from the Porte Maillot to the Tuileries. The window up there opened gently, and the colonel appeared on the balcony wearing his helmet, his saber, and all the old-fashioned but still glorious regalia of one of Mille Hautes cuirassiers. I still wonder what willpower, what spurt of vitality it had taken to put him on his feet again in all the trappings of war. At all events, there he was, standing erect behind the rail, surprised to find the avenue so large, so silent, the window curtains down, and Paris as gloomy as a great pest house, flags everywhere, but such strange flags bearing a red cross on a white field, and no crowd to meet our soldiers. For an instant he thought he might be mistaken, but no. Below, behind the Arc de Triomphe, there came an indistinct rattle, and then a black line advanced in the early light. Then, little by little, the eagles on the tops of helmets could be seen shining in the sun. The little drums of Genappe began to beat, and under the Arc de l'Étoile, accented by the heavy tread of marching men and by the clash of sidearms, Schubert's triumphal march burst out. Suddenly the silence of the Place de l'Étoile was broken by a terrible cry. "To arms! To arms, the Prussians!" And the four Uhlans at the head of the column could see up there on the balcony a tall old man stagger and fall. This time, Colonel Jouve was really dead. One of my favorites, as regular viewers of this show well know. Our story coup de grace for the evening is by none other than the master Jack London. So, one note on the character that opens the narrative by speaking. There is a lady in this named Joy Molyneux. Now, Joy is a Native American of the Great White North, and she has learned to speak English by way of speaking French first. So she has an extremely unusual accent that took me quite a while to get right. But Jack London writes out syllable for syllable a lot of her pronunciations. She is just strikingly clear as a representation of someone or several someones that Jack London spoke to in person, because he really got her dialect well recorded and specific. So, yeah, Arpegia has traced it. French-American Indian, indeed. And it doesn't really specify, but I wouldn't be surprised if Joy Molyneux spoke more than 3 languages. Her native tongue, English, French. She probably spoke at least a 4th, 5th. Extremely versatile multilingual people she represents. With that, I give you A Daughter of the Aurora by Jack London. You, what you call lazy mans. You lazy mans would desire me to have for a wife. It is not good, huh? Never, no, never will lazy mans my husband be. Thus, Joy Molyneux spoke her mind to Jack Harrington, even as she had spoken it, but more tritely and in his own native tongue, to Louis Savoy the previous night. Now listen, Joy. No. Why must I listen to lazy mans, huh? It is very bad you hang around and make visitation to my cabin and do nothing. How you get grub for the famine, huh? Why have you not the dust? Other mans have plenty. But I work hard, Joy. Never a day am I not on trail or up creek. Even now I just come off. My dogs are still yet tired. Other men have luck and find plenty of gold. I have no luck. But when this man with the wife, which is Indian, this man McCormack, when him discover the Klondike, you go nuts. Other mans go. Other mans now reach with the dust. You know I was prospecting over on the head reaches of the Tanana, Harrington protested, and knew nothing of the El Dorado or the Bonanza till it was too late. That is different, huh? Only you are what you call way off. What? You are way off. Yes, in the dark. It is never too late. One very rich gold mine is there on the creek, which is El Dorado. The mans drives the stake and him go away. No other mans know what of him become. This man's, him which drives the stake, is never no more. 60 days. No mans on that claim file the paper. Then other mans, plenty other mans, what you call, jump that claim. Then they race, so quick like the winds to file the paper. Him be very rich. Him get grub for the famine. Harrington hid the major portion of his interest. So, when's the time up? He asked. Exactly what claim is it? So I speak Louis Savoy last night, she continued, ignoring him. Him, I think to be the winner. Hang Louis Savoy! So, Louis Savoy, speak in my cabin last night. Louis, him say, Joy, I am strong mans. I have good dogs. I have long wind. I will be winner. Then you will have me for husband? And I say to him, what you say? I say, if Louis Savoy is winner, then will he have me for a wife? And if he don't win, then Louis Savoy, him will not be, what you call the father of my children. And if I win, you? You win there? Never. Exasperating as it was, Joy Millionew's laughter was pretty to hear. Oh, Harrington didn't mind it. He had long since been broken in. Besides, he was no exception. She had forced all her lovers to suffer in kind. Very enticing she was just then. Her lips just parted, her color heightened by the sharp kiss of the frost, her eyes vibrant with the lure which is the greatest of all lures and which be seen nowhere save in a woman's eyes. Her sled dogs clustered about her in hair-sweet masses, and the leader, Wolfgang, laid his long snout softly in her lap. If I do win, Harrington pressed. She looked from the dog to her lover, back again. What do you say, Wolfgang? If him strong minds and files the paper, shall we his wife become? Eh? What is that you say? What is that you say, huh? Well, Wolfgang pricked up his ears and just growled at Harrington. It is very cold, she suddenly added with feminine irrelevance, rising to her feet and straightening out the team. Her lover looked on stolidly. She had kept him guessing from the very first time they met, and patience had been joined to his virtues. Ah! Wolfgang! She cried, springing upon the sled as it leapt into sudden motion. Hiya! Mush on! From the corner of his eye, Harrington watched her swinging down the trail to 40 Mile, where the road forked and crossed the river to Fort Cudahy. She halted the dogs and turned about. Oh, Mr. Lazy Mounts, she called back. Wolfgang say yes, if you be the race winner. But somehow, as such things will, it leaked out, and all the town 40 Mile, which had hitherto speculated on Joy Millionew's choice between her two latest lovers, now hazarded bets and guesses as to which would win in the forthcoming race. The camp divided itself into two factions, and every effort was put forth in order that their respective favorites might be the first in at the finish. There was a scramble for the best dogs the country could afford, for dogs, and good ones, was essential above all to success, and it meant much to the victor. Besides the possession of a wife, the lack of which had yet to be created, it stood for a gold mine worth $1 million at least. That fall, when news came down of McCormick's discovery on Bonanza, all the lower country, Circle City, 40 Mile included, had stampeded up the Yukon. At least all save those who, like Jack Harrington, and Louis Savoy, they were away out prospecting in the west. Moose pastures and creeks were staked indiscriminately and promiscuously, and incidentally, one of the unlikeliest of creeks, El Dorado. See, what Joy was explaining a little while ago was there's this man, Olaf Nelson. Olaf laid claim to 500 linear feet of the creek, duly posted his notice, and just as duly disappeared. At that time, The nearest recording office was in the police barracks at Fort Cudahy, just across the river from 40 Mile. But when it became rumored abroad that El Dorado Creek was a treasure house, it was quickly discovered that Olaf Nelson had failed to make the down Yukon trip to file upon his property. Well, men cast hungry eyes upon the ownerless claim, where they knew $1,000 waited the use of a shovel and a sluice box. Yet, they dared not touch it, for there was a law which permitted 60 days to elapse between the staking and the filing, during which time a claim was immune. The whole country knew of Olaf Nelson's disappearance, and scores of men made preparation for the jumping and for the consequent race to Fort Cudahy. But competition at 40 Mile was limited, with the camp devoting its energies to the equipping either of Jack Harrington or of Louis Savoy. No man was unwise enough to enter the contest single-handed. It was a stretch of 100 miles to the recorder's office, and it was planned that the two favorites should have 4 relays of dogs stationed along the trail. Naturally, the last relay was to be the crucial one, and for these 25 miles, their respective partisans strove to obtain the strongest possible animals. So bitter did the factions wax, and so high did they bid, the dogs brought stiffer prices than ever before in the annals of the country. And, as it chanced, this scramble for dogs turned the public eye still more searchingly upon Joy Molyneux. Not only was she the cause of it all, but she possessed the finest sled dog from Chilkoot to the Bering Sea. As wheel or as leader, Wolfgang had no equal. The man whose sled he led down the last stretch, that was the man that was bound to win. There could be no doubt of it. But the community had an innate sense of the fitness of things. Not once was Joy vexed by overtures for his use. And the factions drew consolation from the fact that if one man did not profit by him, neither should the other. However, since man, in the individual or in the aggregate, had been so fashioned that he goes through life blissfully obtuse to the deeper subtleties of his womankind, so the men of 40 Mile failed to divine the inner deviltry of Joy Molyneux. They confessed afterward that they had failed to appreciate this dark-eyed daughter of the Aurora, whose father had traded furs in the country before ever they dreamt of invading it, and who had herself first opened eyes on the scintillant northern lights. Nay, accident of birth had not rendered her less the woman, nor had it limited her woman's understanding of men. They knew she played with them, but they did not know the wisdom of her play, its deepness, its deftness. They failed to see more than the exposed cards, so that to the very last 40 Mile was in a state of pleasant obfuscation. And it was not until she cast her final trump card that it came to reckon up the score. Early in the week, the camp turned out to start Jack Harrington and Louis Savoy on their way. They had taken a shrewd margin of time, for it was their wish to arrive at Olaf Nelson's claim some days previous to the expiration of its immunity, that they might rest themselves and their dogs be fresh for the first relay. On the way up, They found the men of Dawson already stationing spare dog teams along the trail, and it was obvious that little expense had been spared in view of the millions at stake. A couple of days after the departure of their champions, 40 Mile began sending up their relays, first to the 75-mile station, then to the 50, and at last to the 25. The teams for the last stretch were magnificent, and so equally matched that the camp discussed their relative merits for a full hour at 50 below before they were permitted to pull out. At the last moment, Joy Molyneux dashed in among them on her sled. She drew Lon McFain, who had charge of Harrington's team, to one side, and hardly had the first words left her lips when it was noticed that his lower jaw dropped with a celerity and emphasis suggestive of great things. He unhitched Wolfgang from her sled, put him at the head of Harrington's team, and mushed the string of animals into the Yukon Trail. Poor Louis Savoy, men said, but Joy Molyneux flashed her black eyes defiantly and drove back to her father's cabin. Midnight drew near on Olaf Nelson's claim. A few hundred fur-clad men had preferred 60 below, and the jumping to the inducements of warm cabins and comfortable bunks. Several score of them had their notices prepared for posting and their dogs at hand. A bunch of Captain Constantine's mounted police had been ordered on duty that fair play might rule. The command had gone forth that no man should place a stake till the last second of the day had tickled itself into the past. In the Northland, such commands are equal to Jehovah's in the matter of potency. The dum-dum as rapid and effective as the thunderbolt. It was clear, and it was cold. The aurora borealis painted palpitating, colorful revels on the sky. Rosy waves of cold brilliancy swept across the zenith, while great coruscating bars of greenish white blotted out the stars, where a Titan's hand reared mighty arches above the pole. And at this mighty display, the wolf dogs howled as had their ancestors of old time. A bearskin-coated policeman stepped prominently to the fore, watch in hand. Men hurried among the dogs, rousing them to their feet, untangling their traces, straightening them out. The entries came to the mark, firmly gripping stakes and notices. They'd gone over the boundaries of the claim so often that they could now have done it blindfolded. Well, the policeman raised his hand. Casting off their superfluous furs and blankets, and with a final cinching of belts, they came to attention. Time? 60 pairs of hands unmittened, as many pairs of moccasins gripped hard upon the snow. Go! They shot across the wide expanse, round the four sides, sticking notices at every corner and down the middle where the two center stakes were to be planted. Then they sprang for the sleds on the frozen bed of the creek, and anarchy of sound and motion broke out. Sled collided with sled, and dog team fastened upon dog team with bristling manes and screaming fangs. The narrow creek was glutted with the struggling mass. Lashes and butts of dog whips were distributed impartially among men and brutes, and to make it greater moment, each participant had a bunch of comrades intent on breaking him out of a jam. But one by one, and by sheer strength, the sleds crept out and shot from sight in the darkness of the overhanging banks. Jack Harrington had anticipated this crush and waited by his sled till it untangled. Louis Savoy, aware of his rival's greater wisdom in the matter of dog driving, had followed his lead and also waited. The route had passed beyond earshot when they took the trail, and it was not till they had traveled the 10 miles or so down to the Bonanza that they came upon it, speeding along in single file but well bunched up. There was little noise and less chance of one passing another at that stage. The sleds, from runner to runner, measured 16 inches wide, the trail 18. But the trail, packed down fully a foot by the traffic, was more like a gutter. On either side spread the blanket of soft snow crystals. If a man turned into this in an endeavor to pass, his dogs would wallow perforce their bellies and slow down to a snail's pace if they hit the wall of this little gutter. So the men lay close to their leaping sleds and they waited. No alteration in position occurred down the 15 miles of Bonanza and Klondike to Dawson, where the Yukon was encountered. Here, the first relays waited. But here, intent to kill their first teams if necessary, Harrington and Savoy had had their fresh teams placed a couple of miles beyond those of the others. In the confusion of changing sleds, they passed full half the bunch. Perhaps 30 men were still leading them when they shot on to the broad breast of the Yukon. Here was the tug. When the river froze in the fall, a mile of open water had been left between two mighty jams. This had been but recently crusted, the current being swift. Now it was as level, hard, and slippery as a dance floor. The instant they struck this glare ice, Harrington came to his knees, holding precariously on with one hand, his whip singing fiercely among his dogs, and fearsome abjurations hurtling about their ears. The team spread out in the smooth surface, each straining to the utmost, but few men in the north could lift their dogs as did Jack Harrington. At once he began to pull ahead, and Louis Savoy, taking the pace, hung on desperately, his leaders running even with the tail of his rival's sled. Midway on the glassy stretch, their relays shot out from the bank, but Harrington did not slacken. Watching his chance when the new sled swung in close, he leapt across, shouting as he did so and jumping up the pace of his fresh dogs. The other driver just fell off somehow. Savoy did likewise with his relay, and the abandoned teams, swerving to the right and left, collided with the others and piled the ice with confusion. Harrington cut out the pace. Savoy hung on. As they neared the end of the glare ice, they swept abreast of the leading sled. When they shot out into the narrow trail between the soft snowbanks, they led the race, and Dawson, watching by the light of the aurora, swore that it was neatly done. When the frost grows lusty at 60 below, men cannot remain without fire or excessive exercise and expect to live. So, Harrington and Savoy now fell into the ancient custom of ride and run. Leaping from their sleds, tow thongs in hand, they ran behind till the blood resumed its wonted channels and expelled the frost. Then back to the sleds till the heat again ebbed away. Thus, riding and running and riding and running, they covered the second and third relays. Several times on smooth ice, Savoy spurted his dogs, and as often failed to gain past. Strung along for 5 miles in the rear, the remainder of the race strove to overtake him, but vainly, for to Louis Savoy alone was the glory given of keeping Jack Harrington's killing pace. As they swung into the 75-mile station, Lon McFain dashed alongside. Wolfgang, in the lead, caught Harrington's eye, and he knew that the race was his. No team in the north could pass him on those last 25 miles, and when Savoy saw Wolfgang heading his rival's team, he knew that he was out of the running, and he cursed softly to himself in the way women is most frequently cursed. But he still clung to the other smoking trail, gambling on chance to the last. And as they churned along, the day breaking in the southeast, they marveled in joy and sorrow at that which Joy Molyneux had done. 40 Mile had early crawled out of its sleeping furs and congregated near the edge of the trail. From this point, it could view the up Yukon course to its first bend several miles away. Here it could also see across the river to the finish at Fort Cudahy, where the gold recorder nervously awaited. Joy Molyneux had taken her position several rods back from the trail, and under the circumstances, the rest of 40 Mile forebore interposing itself. So, the space was clear between her and the slender line of the course. Fires had been built, and around these men wagered dust and dogs. The odds were long on Wolfgang. "Here they come!" shrilled an Indian boy from the top of a pine. Well, up the Yukon, a black speck appeared against the snow, closely followed by a second. As these grew larger, more black specks manifested themselves, but at a goodly distance to the rear. Gradually, they resolved themselves in dogs and sleds, and men lying flat upon them. "Wolfgang leads," a lieutenant of police whispered to Joy. She smiled her interest back. 10-1 on Harrington, cried a Birch Creek king, dragging out his gold sack. The queen, her pay you not much?" queried Joy. The lieutenant shook his head. "You have some dust now, eh? How much do you have?" she continued. He exposed his gold dust sack. She gauged it with a rapid eye. "Maybe, say, 200, eh? Good. Now, I give what you call the tip, eh? Cover the bet." Joy smiled inscrutably. The lieutenant pondered. He glanced up the trail. The two men had risen to their knees and were lashing their dogs furiously, Harrington in the lead. 10-1 on Harrington, bawled the Birch Creek king, flourishing his gold dust sack in the lieutenant's face. "Cover the bet," Joy prompted. He obeyed, shrugging his shoulders in token that he yielded not to the dictate of his reason, but to her charm. Joy nodded to reassure him. All noise ceased. Men paused in the placing of bets. Yawing and reeling and plunging, like luggers before the wind, the sleds swept wildly upon them, though he still kept his leader up to the tail of Harrington's sled. Louis Savoy's face was without hope. Harrington's mouth was set. He looked neither to the right nor to the left. His dogs were leaping in perfect rhythm, firm-footed, close to the trail, and Wolfgang, head low and unseeing, whining softly, was leading his comrades magnificently. 40 Mile stood breathless. Not a sound, save the roar of the runners and the voice of the whips. Then, the clear voice of Joy Molyneux rose on the air. "Hi-ya! Wolfgang! Wolfgang!" Wolfgang heard. He left the trail sharply, heading directly for his mistress. The team dashed after him, and the sled poised an instant on a single runner, then shot Harrington into the snow. Savoy was by like a flash. Harrington pulled to his feet and watched him skimming across the river to the gold recorders. He could not help hearing what was being said. Him do very well, Joy Molyneux was explaining to the lieutenant. Him call, what you say, set the pace, huh? Yes, him set the pace very well. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Fireside Tales with Wolfgang. To view more of my work, check out my YouTube channel at Hunter's Acoustic Cabin. Directed by Hunter Ackerman. Endorsed by Wolfgang Beastly. Produced by GWC Productions. Originally broadcast on GWC Productions' YouTube channel, CAPS Media Television Channel 6, KPPQ LP Ventura at 104.1 FM, and on the KPPQ Podcast Network.